What is sortition governance, and what are its advantages and disadvantages? And the idea is pretty simple. It's just that you randomly select from a population the people who will be the governors, the people who will make up the Senate, make up the House of Representatives. And so instead of actually electing people, you simply have a lottery, and whoever in the population happens to win the lottery, those people go to Congress. Those people will serve on the committees. Those people will vote laws into action. And if you actually think about where in our system do we currently have something like a sortition, this is going to be the jury. Like, juries are essentially randomly selected from the population to make a really important decision that's sort of enacting justice. So it's really about moving that jury system into other realms of governance besides just the law. Now, I think it's easiest to think about these governance mechanisms as if they were being implemented at the national level to govern a country. But with a lot of these systems, they could be used at different levels to resolve disputes. And these disputes could be at the local level, like if there's a dispute between a local government and a contractor who was hired to build a school. And those two groups are trying to resolve that dispute. You could have a randomly selected group of the population come in to make a decision about how to adjudicate between those two actors. So, and of course, online governance, I think, is going to be key for the future. So if you're trying to resolve a dispute between, say, a social media company and a group of citizens who are upset about the way the social media company is operating, that dispute could be resolved by a randomly selected sample of the people on that platform. So there's lots of different realms where this could be applied that aren't just the national level. And I'm personally most hopeful about something like this if it were to be used in a governance system that had different governing bodies using checks and balances to hold each other in check. Let me actually start with the disadvantages, because they're fairly significant, even though I'm excited about this kind of governance system. So the first disadvantage here is that many citizens may have zero interest in learning about some of the complex problems in our society. So like healthcare systems, or the way the legal system works, or governance over regulation for buildings. I mean, all of these issues have a ton of incentives in place. It's a system that's really big and unwieldy. And to understand any particular governance change that you might need to make in that system, you kind of have to understand some of the intricacies. Or at the very least, you have to engage with material from people who study those systems to think carefully about the trade-offs of any given policy. And how many citizens want to read through a 100-page or 1,000-page document about the healthcare system to think about a small change in law? Like, a lot of people are just not going to be interested and may not even have sort of the background to read through that kind of material carefully enough to make a good decision if they're randomly selected into like some randomly selected Senate. So I think the first issue here, and I recognize that this makes me sound a little bit elitist, like it's the people who get PhDs in the healthcare system that know better. And I want to be clear, that's not my position at all. Actually, I think sometimes the people with PhDs in the healthcare system, they have some disadvantages that they've sort of been raised in a system that might be biased by money or power structures that bend their understanding of the healthcare system in a way that advantages industry. So I'm not an elitist, really, I'm not, but I'm a realist in the sense that if someone doesn't want to engage with these complicated systems to think critically about them, if they're not interested in doing that, then they may not make great decisions, or their decisions may be random or just not well informed. Whereas at least if you elect an official, they know what they're signing up for. They know that they're going to have to read a bunch of academic studies and a bunch of pros and cons that are complex on any given issue, and they're signing up for that. The second big disadvantage here is that even if you select randomly from people in the population, because of group dynamics, the people who are raised in privileged schools, privileged positions, who have walked in elite circles, those people will tend to be the people who end up leading any committee or group that's randomly selected. And I do think you see this in juries, where who is most likely to be elected as the foreman of the jury, the person who leads and sort of structures the conversation, well, those people are more likely to be from elite circles. So even though the system is trying to reduce the influence of money and power and all that, and it's trying to get a more random selection from the population, the group dynamics and even groupthink can still have some of those hierarchical dynamics that we might be trying to avoid through the use of a sortition. So what are the advantages of a system like this? And I think the number one advantage for me is that it gets the whole population involved in governance. It's kind of like if you've served on a jury for a criminal trial, you suddenly have an inside perspective on how the system works. And you're a little bit engaged with that system and how fair it is. And you kind of understand the complexities of governance, that people can have different opinions and you have to negotiate those opinions. So I think if we used sortition governance at more levels of the governance system, I'm talking locally, state level, national level, then people will have more experience to understand how the decisions are made, the frailties in the system. It educates the population in a way that would make them better voters in other realms, better able to resolve local disputes. So I think the educational value of a sortition system is so high. And this is one of the reasons why I hope that it gets implemented in the online governance economy and in the local governance economy more. I think this could be one feature of a really healthy functioning system. The second advantage of a system like this is simply that the people who would be randomly selected are going to be way more representative of the population they're making a decision for. And this is racially, ideologically, religiously. There are so many dimensions of the human experience that matter in shaping someone's perspective. And randomly selecting people from the population guarantees that you have a random sampling of all of the different dimensions that might influence someone's perspective on governance. The third advantage of this kind of system relates to the way that power can bend the perspective of people moving up inside the system. It gets rid of career politicians. And here's actually what I mean by that. So let's say you're an altruistic young person and you have great motives and you really just want to advocate for your community in the governance system. If you try to work your way up inside the political system, and if you have success as you work your way up, such that people notice, oh, you're a potential future senator, or you're a potential leader who could be a powerful influence in our system, then you're probably going to be targeted by interest groups and corporate interests and people who want to bend your perspective toward their advantage. And if they're good at doing that, you may not even notice that your perspective is being bent away from advocating for your people and toward advocating for the powerful interests. That may be really hard to see from the inside. So if you had a system like a sortition system where people are randomly selected and perhaps only serve a couple of years or 4 years or whatever, then the people who come into the system come in without that long-term relationship building and influence from the powers that are in place. So getting rid of career politicians could definitely be an advantage here. One of the most important things I think with governance is to have a really good line of communication between the people making the decisions and the people who are affected by those decisions. And if you have career politicians, or if everybody in the system is so far removed from their working class home life that it's been 20 years since they were in that community and really understanding the intricacies of the pain and the injustices that community experiences, then they may have forgotten some of the key things. And if you have people who are constantly cycling into the governance system who are very close to the issues that the working class and the people and underserved populations are experiencing, they are going to be able to better articulate the problems if they're more fresh out of that community. They also may have more genuine connections with people in that community that are alive. So if you're debating an issue and you're thinking about how would this affect the general population, they can just make a phone call to their friend and their family and their church community, and those people can sort of say, here's our perspective and why. Rather than I think a lot of times what happens now is senators and representatives, they do hear from people at the bottom of the system, people most harshly affected, but the groups they end up talking to are sort of sorted and selected very carefully rather than selected naturally through their own friend group. And I think that does make a difference in terms of the communication lines between the decision makers and those affected. So those are the advantages and disadvantages. The only other thing I want to say is that I think this kind of system could work well, not as necessarily the main way that governance happens, but rather as one part of the system that holds other governance mechanisms in check. So, like we know when the United States Constitution was built, they intentionally built in checks and balances between the three branches of governance: the president, Congress, and the Supreme Court. All of those three are meant to sort of hold each other in check. And I do think if there were a branch that were a sortition-based governance system, that could actually add some nice checks and balances against other governance systems.